All right. This is the Purple Huddle as usual. I am your host, Josh Fry, the managing editor over at purpleptsd.com. Maybe the offseason, but Vikings news never stops. So be sure to check out both vikingsterritory.com and purpleptsd.com for all sorts of Vikings news over the course of the offseason. Today, going to do things a little bit different. Usually this is a halftime show, but obviously there are no Vikings games anymore. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. And we're going to start talking about some of the offseason topics heading into free agency, the draft. Obviously, those are a few months away yet, but never too early to start talking about them. Going to give it a few minutes and let some people get in here, and then we'll get going into some of the topics today. And as usual, if you have any questions, you have your own opinions, comments, feel free to just drop them in either the Facebook comments or the YouTube page. We're live on both sides. So sure to follow both. Subscribe to the YouTube, follow the Facebook page, join the Facebook group, the new purpleptsd.com Facebook group. That thing has been popping off with all sorts of Vikings fans sharing opinions. So it's a great place for a great community of Vikings fans, just being football fans and sharing their opinions. So really cool stuff happening over there. Be sure to follow all of them. But yeah, let's start off with some of the the free agency here. Obviously the Vikings have just oodles of players set to hit the open market. We've talked about a number of them already, but just to rehash some of the big names hitting free agency this offseason. Obviously Kirk Cousins, Danielle Hunter, those are the main two. But then behind them as well, there are some sneaky playmakers that might be playing in different uniforms next year between Jordan Hicks, Dalton Reisner, Greg Joseph, Chris Reed, Jonathan Bullard, Brandon Powell, Johnny Munt, DJ Wanham. There's KJ Osborne. Can't leave him out either. There's a lot of guys on this roster from last season that played pretty crucial roles that could be playing elsewhere in 2024. So it looks like it's going to be a very interesting offseason for the Minnesota Vikings coming up. But how exactly do they go about filling this roster? Well, I mean, obviously there's a draft. They've got 9 draft selections coming up in April. So there's no Nkwesi There's going to be some trades where Vikings are either moving up or down, acquiring more draft picks. So that should be a very interesting weekend at the end of April when that rolls around. And even before that free agency, honestly, to me, there are about 5 or 6 positions that the Vikings really need to address heading into the offseason. Obviously, starting off first and foremost at the quarterback position. Who knows what happens with Kirk Cousins? Does he resign? There was a few interesting quotes from Cousins about potentially joining Bill Belichick, and seems like he's first in line to land that Atlanta Falcons job. So that would be an interesting landing spot. Go into the NFC South with a division that really doesn't have a clear-cut favorite. Obviously, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have made it to the divisional round, but how real is that? They went 9-8 in the regular season. They had a nice stretch from about week 10 to week 16, but they had a few clunkers in there as well, and then they just benefited from the Philadelphia Eagles just completely derailing down the stretch of the year, and they ran into them in the playoffs and just absolutely smoked them. But what happens with Kirk? Does he go to Atlanta? If Bill Belichick lands that job, does he go down there and help Atlanta try to build a Super Bowl contender? Because that's a team that's got a lot of playmakers on the offensive side of the ball. It doesn't seem like it at times because Arthur Smith just refused to utilize some of them. But between Bijan Robinson, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, that's an offense that you plug in a guy like Kirk Cousins and they all of a sudden become a pretty high-powered offense, in my opinion, at least. But for the Vikings, what does it take to keep Kirk around? Because I don't think that they're going to offer him anything huge. It'd probably end up him having to take a hometown discount of, I don't know, 35 million a year. And even then that might be a touch high in terms of the Vikings' willingness to keep him around. Obviously he's got that $28.5 million dead cap for this season, but you could also argue that means it's a perfect time to transition to a rookie quarterback. So between Kirk, his uncertain future, potentially drafting one of the top guys at the quarterback position this offseason, quarterback is definitely a position to keep an eye on over the next few months for the Minnesota Vikings. Next up, I think running back is an area that you could argue either way, but I think that they need to add a body to that room. Because especially if you look at their red zone numbers last year, they were absolutely horrible near the goal line. Alexander Madison had 23 carries in the red zone for just 21 yards, no touchdowns, a whopping average of 0.9 yards per carry down there. Ty Chandler was a little bit more efficient, but he only got 11 touches down there. Maybe that's just the solution. The Vikings just get him more touches in the red zone, but they absolutely have to have a more balanced offense next year. We've seen pretty much every single playoff team that remains was in the top half in terms of both passing yards and rushing yards. They utilized both very effectively throughout the regular season. Green Bay, they're playing today, and they didn't have a great rushing attack for a while, but once Aaron Jones came back from those injuries, he really buoyed that rushing offense, and that's big reason why they're still alive in the playoffs, because he's looked absolutely fantastic and he seems to have completely dodged all those season injuries. So I think running back is definitely a position for the Vikings to pay attention to this offseason. Maybe it doesn't mean adding a body, but I don't know. I think there are a couple of intriguing targets out there. The big one, and maybe this is a little bit of a pipe dream, but I think Derrick Henry, if the Vikings went out and got Derrick Henry, I think that'd be a pretty amazing get for them in that running back room. Obviously, 30 years old. He's not the workhorse back that he used to be. He's definitely lost a year or two. But if you get him down on near the goal line, he's going to find the end zone. He was 6th in the NFL among running backs with 9 touchdowns and on red zone carries this past season. And I mean, he's still a guy that's built like a linebacker. He's like 6'4", 250 pounds. So you get that guy bowling over defenders down near the goal line, he's going to find a way to get into the end zone. I don't know if the Vikings necessarily have the money to swing a move like that, and honestly, I don't think they should pay top dollar for a guy like Henry near the end of his prime. But adding a guy like him to just get those red zone touches and buoy that red zone offense a little bit, because the Vikings are absolutely horrible in the red zone. One of the worst teams in terms of red zone touchdown percentage this season, and that in and of itself was a big reason why they just weren't able to successfully put points on the board and make the playoffs, because they just weren't able to punch the ball into the end zone. So running back is a position that I think definitely needs to be near the top of the Vikings list this offseason. Another one, wide receiver. You could say, why does a team need to look at wide receiver when they've got Jordan Addison and Justin Jefferson in the room? Obviously, those are two of the best wide receivers in the entire league right now. But at the end of the day, you need more bodies, because KJ Osborne, Brandon Powell, those guys are both set to hit free agency this spring. And outside of those two guys is like Jalen Naylor. And then that's about it for the Vikings at wide receiver. N'Keal Harry was there too, but I mean, he barely contributed on the offensive side of the ball, at least. So the Vikings just need to find a way to add some sort of body in that room that can consistently catch ball. I personally would like them to go get a speed threat to just be a guy that can catch those deep balls, spread the offense a little bit, keep opposing secondaries thinking. A guy that I'd really like to look at in the draft, at least, would be Moose Muhammad out of Texas A&M. Dude's absolutely ridiculous in that department. He's probably going to test at 4.3, low 4.4s at the combine. So that's a name that I'm keeping an eye out for, at least. It probably will be like a day 3 pick that the Vikings would end up getting him too. So it's not like the Vikings would have to dole out some huge amount of draft capital in order to get a guy like that either. But yeah, that's for the offense, at least. Those are the 3 main positions that I'm looking at. But a sneaky one, I think tight end. I think tight end is a spot that the Vikings need to keep an eye on as well, because obviously TJ Hawkinson had that injury down the stretch of the season. Doesn't seem like he's going to be fully healthy for the start of the year, considering when that injury occurred in week 16 against the Lions, that had torn ACL and MCL. Those two combined, he could be looking at a pretty lengthy recovery time for those injuries. So tight end is definitely a position I'm keeping an eye on, because Johnny Munt's also a free agent. And when Hawkinson went down, he was the guy that got the bulk share of the targets in the passing game, and his blocking ability is something that the Vikings definitely value. And if he were to go elsewhere, that leaves Josh Oliver, Nick Muse, who played a little bit down the stretch, but I mean, he hasn't really proven himself and a capable NFL tight end yet. So tight end is definitely a position to keep an eye on. And then moving over to the defense, cornerback. I think they need to find somebody in that room because it was very clear after Mekhi Blackmon and Byron Murphy got hurt that they simply just didn't have the bodies to keep up with a lot of the offenses in the league. They, especially against the Lions and Packers in the final 3 weeks, they just were gashed on the defensive side of the ball by those receivers. And granted, those are two of the more talented wide receiver rooms in the league right now, but those are two teams in the division, and you're going to have to play them twice every single year, regardless of what the rest of the schedule looks like. So I think that cornerback is definitely a room that they need to at least keep an eye on heading into free agency. They only had 11 interceptions last year. It was near the bottom of the league. I think it was tied for 19th or something like that. So they just need a guy in there that can not only keep up with those wide receivers, but make those momentum changing turnovers that we didn't see the Vikings do a lot of this season. And then defensive line is another one that I'm looking at. Obviously, Danielle Hunter, DJ Wanham hitting free agency, Jonathan Bullard also hitting free agency. So that defensive line is looking rather thin right now if the Vikings aren't able to retain at least two of those three guys. And especially in Danielle Hunter's case, he absolutely carried that pass rush throughout the entire season. So Vikings need to find some sort of pass rushing threat. I'd really like them to retain Hunter and then find either in free agency or the draft some sort of defensive tackle presence that can create some sort of pass rush from the middle of the defensive line. In the draft, I'm looking at a guy like Johnny Newton out of Illinois. I know Daniel Jeremiah yesterday published a mock draft where it was Byron Murphy the second, which would definitely cause some confusion with Vikings fans with both Byron Murphy at defensive tackle and at cornerback, which is just a funny little wrinkle. But I think Byron Murphy is definitely a guy to keep an eye on come draft season as well. But for free agents, I really would like them to go after a guy like, I don't know, Sheldon Rankins out of Houston. He had 6 sacks this season. He's one of the better pass rushing defensive tackles in the league. It might be a bit costly to bring him in, but definitely a guy to keep an eye on. Off the edge, Josh Uche out of New England. Kind of a situation where they picked up Harrison Phillips, where Uche is a high-end backup type of player, doesn't get a ton of snaps in New England's defense, but that was one of the better defensive units in the entire league, regardless of what their record suggested at the end of the season. A lot of their troubles were from offense, not from defense. And Uche is a guy that continuously, when he was on the field, was pretty dang good as a pass rusher. So definitely a name to keep an eye on when free agency rolls around in March. Those are basically the main positions that I'd be looking at for the Vikings right now. This offseason as needs, just getting bodies in those rooms, improving those rooms first and foremost, but secondarily just making sure that you have enough bodies, because it became very clear down the stretch of the year that the Vikings just simply did not have enough bodies in those rooms to continuously just create pressure on opposing offenses and stop the run, get after opposing quarterbacks. So those are basically my main concerns with the Vikings heading into the offseason. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, maybe, defensive line, cornerback. Those are pretty much where I see a lot of Minnesota's focus going into the offseason. And Kwesi Adofo-Mensah said it in the end of season press conference. This is going to be a big offseason for the Vikings. So will be interesting to see where they end up going. Let's pivot a little bit. Obviously, the divisional round of the playoffs begins today, and we've got 2 NFC North teams playing today, or this weekend, not today necessarily, but Green Bay and Detroit. Green Bay is headed out to San Francisco. They play tonight. But firstly, Houston Texans at Baltimore Ravens. Drop comments if you have predictions on how these games are going to go, because I'm interested to see how you guys are seeing these playoffs turning out. But all 4 of these matchups look really, really interesting on paper. Houston going into Baltimore. Obviously, CJ Stroud has been absolutely fantastic for the Texans all season long. I just think that this is going to be a little bit similar to what happened in week 1 between these two teams, where Baltimore got the better of CJ Stroud. They definitely made him look like a rookie quarterback. He made a few mistakes here and there. And I think Stroud, as good as he's been, he's definitely had a few turnover worthy plays here and there. Even last week against the Browns, he had a couple passes that probably should have been intercepted, but they just weren't. So I think Baltimore is going to be able to, with that just tremendous secondary they've got with Kyle Hamilton at safety, Marcus Williams as well. I think that the secondary is going to be able to take advantage of some of these rookie mistakes from Stroud and force a couple turnovers. And I think Baltimore is going to win this one. I think it'll be pretty close. I think spread right now is like 9.5, 10 points. I think Houston's going to be able to keep it close just because Stroud is a really great quarterback. But yeah, I think that Baltimore is going to pull out a close one here. And then Green Bay going to San Francisco. I mean, it's kind of a tale as old as time, you know, just the 49ers historically just have Green Bay's number. Obviously, this is the Jordan Love Packers, not the Aaron Rodgers Packers anymore. But I mean, if San Francisco is healthy and it looks like Christian McCaffrey is going to be able to suit up and play, I've said it basically all season. If the 49ers are able to stay healthy with their stars, I think that they are the shoe-in favorite to win the NFC this year. So as good as Green Bay has been down the stretch of the season, I think 49ers are going to be able to put a lot of pressure on Jordan Love with those pass rushers, Chase Young, Nick Bosa, and Javon Hargrave in the middle of that defensive line. So I think 49ers are going to win this one tonight pretty handily. Moving on to tomorrow, Detroit is taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This is an interesting game for sure, too. Tampa Bay, they've come on strong down the stretch of the season. They've had a few hiccups here and there, and we talked about that earlier in the show. But I think that I do think that last weekend was kind of Detroit's Super Bowl a little bit, where they finally got that monkey off their back. They won their first playoff game in 32 years. They're coming off their first NFC championship this season. Regardless of how it goes the rest of the way, this is definitely has to be deemed a success for the Detroit Lions. Whereas for the Buccaneers, they have a lot to play for right now. Baker Mayfield's heading into free agency. He might be due a lot of money if they can win this game, and I think that they recognize this opportunity. They play some really gritty football, and obviously the Lions do as well. But I think with Mike Evans at wide receiver, he's another guy that's hitting free agency this offseason. So an interesting name to keep an eye on there as well. But I think with Tampa Bay, I think that they've got their mojo going. Baker Mayfield's playing like himself. Todd Bowles has said it all season long. He's encouraged Baker Mayfield to just be himself at the quarterback position. And I think he's done a really good job of that. Again, it's ugly football in Tampa Bay, but that's how they win games. That's how they've won games all season. And I think Tampa Bay is going to go into Detroit and pull off an upset here. And then finally, we've got the game of the year potentially between the Buffalo Bills and Kansas City Chiefs. We saw it earlier in the regular season where Buffalo was able to go into Arrowhead and win. And this is the third time in the past 4 years that these two teams have met in the playoffs. I think that this is Josh Allen's time, man. I just think that even with all the injuries on the defensive side of the ball, I just don't trust Kansas City's pass catchers enough to really put a ton of pressure on this defense. I don't think we've had a reason to trust that wide receiver room all season long Rashee Rice has come on really strong during his rookie season, but Marquez Valdes-Scantling is definitely due for a couple drops here and there. Who knows what happens with Kadarius Toney and Travis Kelce? He has these games where he looks like a shell of himself sometimes. And with Buffalo finally getting Kansas City at home, I think that they're going to be able to pull this one out. It's probably going to be a very close game, a very entertaining game. Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen are both fantastic quarterbacks, but Buffalo finally gets the monkey off their back, and they advance to the AFC Championship game, where they will travel to Baltimore and take on Lamar Jackson in his first ever AFC Championship game if they win this afternoon. But yeah, I think that's about all I've got for you today. Hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend. Thanks to everybody who tunes in, and thank you for if you watch after the show as well. Thank you for giving it a watch, giving it a listen. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow the Facebook page, join the Facebook group Purple PTSD. I'm Josh Fry, managing editor of purpleptsd.com, and I will see you guys next weekend.